25 by Judy Gardiner. Read by Brian Blessed.
The soprano gave a last appalling squawk, collapsed on her knees, and died. Profoundly relieved, Lacey turned to study his wife's reaction and saw that tears were travelling slowly down her cheeks. He watched her close her eyes in glorious suffering. The curtain swept down, and she began to clap feebly, all passion spent. Lacey clapped too, but with a simple briskness of someone who has come out of the darkness into the light. In the past, he had sometimes envied Winifred's artistic sensitivity, and had even tried briefly to cultivate some of his own, but each time it flew away and left him the same as he had been before, a rather stolid person who liked playing snooker. Now he was content to remain as nature ordained. When the curtain had risen and fallen for the third time, she allowed him to adjust the little white fur tippet thing round her shoulders and lead her from the theatre. A chill wind met them outside, and she stumbled against him. "Can't we get a taxi?" "Look at the queue. It's not far to walk." "I don't know the way." "No, but I do." Clutching her firmly by the elbow, he marched her away from the surging mass of opera lovers and down a narrow street shining darkly after the rain. "Oh, Jamie, my shoe hurts." "It won't be long now." "But it's hurting." "So what do you expect me to do? Carry you?" He'd have carried her all right, 25 years ago, slung her up in his arms like some darling, delicate baby and been happy when people stared. But 25 years is a long time, and things don't stay the same. He splashed in a puddle and heard her wince. "Real life seems so awful after all that beauty." "You're right." "Because it wasn't all tragedy. I mean, the story was, and so was the whole underlying theme. But I thought the man who sang The Alchemist was terribly funny, didn't you?" "Yes," said Lacey, who had never laughed aloud in an opera, except for the time when José got his nose trapped in Carmen's castanet. "Yeah, he was a real clown." They walked on. "I do wish you could have got a taxi." "Nearly there." "Yes, but it's my birthday." "I know it's your birthday," he said. 25 of her birthdays, and not counting the one when they were only engaged. And each of them had been celebrated by going to something artistic and having to discuss it afterwards over dinner. It was one of those restaurants that have a striped awning and dwarf evergreens in window boxes. They went inside, and the head waiter conducted them to a table for two against the wall. Settling herself, she glanced around appreciatively. "I read about it in one of the glosses," she said happily, "while I was having my hair done." "Very nice," he said. "Martini?" She nodded. Then her bright smile faltered, and he watched her expression change to one of diffidence. He knew what was coming. "As it's my birthday, could I have a Pimm's No. 1? "Of course you can," he said. Every year she asked for a Pimm's No. 1, just as later in the meal she always asked if she could have crepe Suzette. She was a great girl for ritual. He ordered the Pimm's and a double Scotch for himself, then sat back and waited. "Shoe still hurting?" he said at length. "No, not now. Not now I'm sitting down." "My mother suffered agonies with bunions." "It's not a bunion," she said quickly. "Only old people get bunions." The drinks came. Raising his glass, he smiled gallantly and wished her many happy returns. She began to reply, but another waiter had appeared with the menus. They studied them, and she asked for Aylesbury duckling. "Duckling? I thought you always had quail." "No, I love duckling. Quail's too expensive." "Rubbish, have quail." By the time he had finished ordering the meal, his glass was empty. He ordered another double Scotch, then watched her lean across the table to him. "Do you come here often?" It was her routine joke, framed in a bright, pretty smile. She really did look very pretty in the glowing candlelight, and he should have been grateful for all the years she had spent at the dressing-table, patting in lotions and unguents and things. It was no fault of hers that he suddenly longed for a mature, mysterious woman instead of a little tinted, carefully preserved blonde. "I did love it, didn't you?" she said, touching his hand. And he knew that they were about to embark on the annual artistic discussion. Of course, English opera's very different from Italian or German, isn't it? Not only have we very little of it, apart from Britain and poor old Ethel Smythe, but there's something about our national character which doesn't seem to go with the essential theatricality of opera, does it, Jamie? And then the waiter arrived with his whitebait and her snails, and he watched her little hands getting to grips with the big silver tools that always reminded him of dental equipment. "Oh, Jamie," she said, suddenly tremulous, "isn't it lovely, us being here together? Just an old married couple having dinner in a nice restaurant and still being in love." The poulet-fousse was fresh and agreeable, and he took another gulp. "It certainly is. I mean, we're so lucky, both enjoying the good things in life, like music and the arts, and then going back to our nice little home where we share everything." She dug a snail from its shell and transferred it glistening to her mouth. Lacey flinched, certain that it had wriggled. "Some women just amaze me," she said, "the way art doesn't seem to mean anything to them at all. I mean, we all know it's very important to keep yourself looking nice for your husband. I certainly always do my best, but men want something more than that from women, don't they, Jamie? I'm sure most men sometimes feel like plunging really deep into interesting depths." The matchstick bones of her quail lay neatly stripped to one side of her plate. "Poor little sods," Lacey thought lugubriously, and refilled his glass before the waiter could do it for him. The burgundy was rich and heavy after the poulet-fousse, and seemed to be affecting his mood likewise. "I still enjoy a game of snooker," he said, rousing himself. "Funny old boy," she said fondly. "You're just a great big schoolboy at heart, aren't you?" She twittered on about love and happiness, and suddenly he had to get away. Suddenly it was imperative to get away, somewhere quiet where he could lean against a cool wall and let some of the evening's terrible tedium disperse. "Excuse me a moment," he muttered, and shoving back his chair, strode across the restaurant in search of the men's room. Mercifully, it was empty, and he stood with his face pressed against the roller towel, thinking, 25. Next year it'll be 26. He had to get away. Much further away than the men's room. For the first time he saw that what he needed was to strip himself of his marriage, like an insect sloughing off a dead skin. Raising his face, he slowly became aware of the frosted glass window on the opposite wall. With haggard eyes he calculated its dimensions, and then lurched over to it. To his surprise, it opened easily, and a gust of night air flew in his face. And standing there, it came to him that the whole thing was too simple for words. "Here we go, chaps," he said, and spitting lightly on his hands, took 4 backward paces before launching himself at the window ledge. His feet hit the woodwork, and he crouched giddily for a moment before plummeting like a stone into the darkness outside. He had expected to fall much further, and met the ground with a swiftness that jolted his teeth. Picking himself up, he blundered between dustbins and crates of empty bottles before reaching the street. It had started to rain again, and he stood with his head tilted back, so that the drops fell on his upturned face. Swaying, he opened his mouth and joyfully visualized them diluting all the evening's alcohol with their cleansing innocence. He toyed with the idea of taking his clothes off so that he might wash away the accumulated awfulness of the last 25 years, then decided against it. Laughing wildly, he set off down the street. The first thing was to find a hotel for the night, and then tomorrow he would write to Winifred, explaining what had happened. "Dear Winifred, I'm afraid I've left you. My reasons for doing so are hard to explain without running the risk of hurting you unnecessarily, and this I have no wish to do. You have been a good wife to me, Winifred, in your fashion, and I am content to leave it at that. Don't try to find me, Winifred. I am going where I hope to build a new life for myself. I'm fed up to the teeth with your posturings about art and your silly mooing about love. I'm going far away, Winifred, but until such time as you find another man to bore the thingamies off, I am perfectly willing to make financial provision." Which brought him to wonder whether he had sufficient money on him to pay for the hotel when he found it. Wavering to a halt, he took out his wallet and began to count the notes. There seemed to be an unusually large number of them, so he counted again, breathing heavily. Then he remembered. that he had cashed extra money in order to take Winifred out on her birthday. He put his wallet away and walked on, until it occurred to him that he had left Winifred sitting in the restaurant with no means of paying the bill. He stopped again. When he said financial provision, he was, of course, thinking about the common necessities only. But on the other hand, it seemed a bit mean to start the new arrangements before she was even aware that there were to be any. His brain was working slowly, but very clearly, as he turned and walked back the way he had come. His brain was working clearly, but for some reason it chose to ignore any possibility of re-entering the restaurant in the conventional manner. He only knew that having left it by means of the window in the men's room, there was no other course but to return by the same route. Groping among the dustbins, he squinted up the wall and found that during his absence the window had been closed. His heart sank, and all he could think of was Winifred sitting alone at the table with a large bill to pay and only a couple of pounds in her purse. He always saw to it that Winifred never had more than a couple of pounds in her purse. Peering more closely, he found that the window wasn't shut after all. It was merely on the last catch, and to slip his hand inside and release it was simplicity itself. The window was higher from the outside, and he dragged a crate of empty bottles across to stand on. Even so, it was difficult. It took a lot of strength to lever himself up onto his elbows, and he was beginning to feel rather tired. Closing his eyes, he listened to the rain gurgling in the gutters, and then, from a crouching position, half jumped and half fell forward. He landed in darkness, his fall partly broken by a large immovable object that appeared to be made of china. Baffled, he tried to work out why he seemed to be in a large cupboard, and then heard the quick patter of high heels coming towards him. Instinctively he froze. Then the door opened, almost in his face, and the air was torn by a high female scream. "Oh, God! There's a man in there, and he's all wet!" The door slammed to again. Drunkenly, he sank down on the lavatory seat and tried to work out how he had got in through the wrong window. They dragged him out, and although they seemed frightened of him, they wouldn't let him go. There seemed to be dozens of them. "How'd he get in here? Somebody sent for the manager. He was waiting to pinch my bottom. Sex maniac!" "No, look at him," said another voice. And as she loomed out of the fray, Lacey recognised the woman who had sat at the next table. She had eyes like a lizard and a skin the texture of orange pith. "Look at him," she repeated. "He's not a maniac. He's just a creep. A creepy, creepy little creep." She shook her head sorrowfully, and suddenly, overcome with impatience of the whole absurd situation, Lacey tried to lunge past her towards the door. She caught him by the front of his shirt, and there was a pop of exploding buttons. "He's just old and pathetic," she said, tightening her grip, and Lacey roared as her sharp red fingernails bit through his flesh. He tried to fight back, but was hampered by increasing physical exhaustion and a sense that nothing really mattered, while somewhere in the back of his mind lingered the knowledge learned at his mother's knee that nice men didn't hit women. "I can explain." "Like hell you can!" the woman cried joyously and gave him a hard blow on the ear. "Would you mind telling me what you think you're doing with my husband?" said a new voice, new yet oddly familiar. And Lacey opened dazed eyes as the powder-room door swung to behind his wife. Displacing his tormentor with a neat shove of her hip, she went over to him and tucked his shirt back inside the waistband of his trousers. Standing on tiptoe, she smoothed his hair. "I made a mistake," he mumbled. "Of course you did," she smiled at him reassuringly, and he remembered how she had cried in the opera. He put his arm round her shoulders and leaned his stinging ear against her soft-tinted hair. "He was crouching in the loo, waiting to spring," one of the other women said, "and I don't think it's right." Beneath Lacey's armpit, Winifred drew herself erect. "If my husband happened to be in your lavatory," she said slowly and with emphasis, "you can take it from me that he had a watertight reason. And now, if you'll excuse us." They did so, standing back silently while the two Laces, still clamped together, left the room. "I'm awfully sorry, Win," he mumbled in the passage outside. "I can explain exactly what happened. You'll just have to believe me when I say that I wasn't—" "No, of course you weren't," she said, "because you never are you?" He was struck by the odd, brittle quality in her voice. Never what? Oh, shut up, she said, and removing his arm from her shoulder, led the way back to the restaurant. He followed her to the table, which had been swept clear of everything except the salt and pepper and their 2 crumpled napkins. "I must pay the bill," he said, looking round. "I've already paid it." "You've paid it? But that's what I said." Primly, she adjusted her little white fur tippet thing and picked up her handbag. She swept past the head waiter, who bowed. Outside, the rain had dwindled to a slow weeping mist, and Lacey hurried to catch up with her. "You better find us a taxi," she said over her shoulder. But I want to know how you paid the bill." "A taxi," she repeated. And suddenly he was too weary to care any more. Like an old, hopeless dog, he crossed the street and slunk off in the direction of Shaftesbury Avenue, where the lights were bright and taxis were plentiful, and where women earn money by doing all manner of strange and terrible things.
Dacre, Balsden. Lectures start on Monday. Lectures start on the first Monday of term. Lecturers are sometimes in fashion, and in the English school, even glamorous. Lectures, as such, are never in fashion. Why take notes when you could as well read it all in a book? The question is unanswerable. Not, of course, that there always is a book. Not that, if there is, you always read it. But you could. Lectures are born, or monotonously reborn, halfway through the term before the one in which they are delivered. That is the time when the lecture lists go to the printer. That is when the lecturer decides what lecture he shall advertise. Shall he lecture 1 hour a week or 2? If he lectures twice a week, he need only lecture in 1 term of the year. If he lectures 1 hour a week, he must lecture in 2 terms of the year. Those are the conditions under which the majority of the dons are paid to lecture. In some subjects, the lecture list is itself carefully organized by the faculty, so that all the necessary lectures are given, and given in the terms in which undergraduates need them. In other faculties, the freedom of the lecturer is not so rigidly curtailed. Let a lecturer lecture on whatever subject he chooses. If he hopes for an audience, he will choose a subject useful to undergraduates, a subject with a certain breadth, and he will lecture on it twice a week. If he does not care about the size of his audience, and prefers to lecture on some small field of learning on which he happens himself to be researching or writing a learned paper, he will lecture 1 hour a week. Thursday at 11, Mr. Smooth, Plutarch, on the virtue of women. Dons, in general, hate lectures as much as undergraduates. That is why they lecture so badly. Nobody has ever taught them how to lecture well. There is a delegacy in Oxford for the training of schoolmasters and schoolmistresses. There is no delicacy for the training of dons. On the first Monday, the lecturer has his largest audience for the term. Where there are 100 young men and women today, there will, in 8 weeks' time, be no more than 5 or 6. Where there is an audience of 2 today, there will perhaps be 1 next week, and, after that, no audience at all. A professor's lecture is sometimes like the pas seul of a prima ballerina. He appears, he lectures, he retires. And then, after an interval, he lectures again. But the college tutor's public lectures is an interruption in a week otherwise devoted to teaching pupils in his rooms, listening to their essays, and talking about them. These are private hours, toots, as the undergraduates call them, or tutorials. Sometimes a pupil comes alone, sometimes in a pair, sometimes with 2 or 3 others. Once, tutors taught in this way for 10 hours a week. Now, in an inflated university, they teach for 15 or 18, even for 20. Is it surprising if they teach less well? Young tutors find the hour too long. Old tutors find it too short. Undergraduates find it very long indeed. And if there is no clock in the room, they find it even longer. When you reach a tutor's age, it is less easy to listen than to talk. And observant undergraduates quickly realize that their tutors criticize the final sentences of their essays, but give little evidence of having observed the rest. There's a splendid story of the great Ingram Bywater. "Ah," he said, in greeting to his pupil, "what is the subject of your essay?" "Expediency." "Splendid. Then will you read what you have written?" At the end he said, "For the next week, will you write an essay on expediency?" That is all. Had he slept through the whole of the essay? Or was he uttering the most devastating criticism? The pupil never knew. Robert Charles Benchley, Kiddie-Kar Travel. In America, there are 2 classes of travel: first class and with children. The actual physical discomfort of traveling with the kiddies is not so great, although you do emerge from it looking as if you had just moved the piano upstairs single-handed. It is the mental wear and tear that tells. And for a sensitive man, there is only one thing worse, and that is a church wedding in which he is playing the leading comedy role. There are several branches of the ordeal of traveling with children, and it is difficult to tell which is the roughest. Those who have taken a very small baby on a train maintain that this ranks as pleasure alone with having a nerve killed. On the other hand, those whose wee companions are in the romping stage simply laugh at the claims of the first group. Sometimes you will find a man who has both an infant and a romper with him. Such a citizen should receive a salute of 21 guns every time he enters the city, and should be allowed to wear the insignia of the Pater della Rosa, giving him the right to solicit alms on the cathedral steps. There is much to be said for those who maintain that rather should the race be allowed to die out than that babies should be taken from place to place along our national arteries of traffic. On the other hand, there are moments when babies are asleep. Oh yes, there are. There must be. But it is practically a straight run of 10 or a dozen hours for your child of 4. You may have a little trouble in getting the infant to doze off, especially as the train newsboy waits, crouching in the vestibule until he sees signs of slumber on the child's face, and then rushes in to yell, "Cup of life, out today," right by its pink, shell-like ear. But after it is asleep, your troubles are over, except for wondering how you can shift your ossifying arm to a new position without disturbing its precious burden. If the child is of an age which denies the existence of sleep, however, preferring to run up and down the aisle of the car rather than sit in its chair, at least a baby can't get out of its chair unless it falls out, and even then it can't go far, then every minute of the trip is full of fun. On the whole, having traveled with children of all the popular ages, I would be inclined to award the hair shirt to the man who successfully completes the ride with a boy of, let us say, 3. In the first place, you start with the pronounced ill will of 2/3 of the rest of the occupants of the car. You see them as they come in, before the train starts, glancing at you and yours with little or no attempt to conceal the fact that they wish they had waited for the 4 o'clock. Across from you is perhaps a large man who, in his hometown, has a reputation for eating little children. He wears a heavy gold watch chain and wants to read through a lot of reports on the trip. He is just about as glad to be opposite a small boy as he would be if it were a hurdy-gurdy. In back of you is a lady in a black silk dress who doesn't like the porter. Ladies in black silk dresses always seem to board the train with an aversion to the porter. The fact that the porter has to be in the same car with her makes her fussy to start with. And when she discovers that in front of her is a child of 3 who is already eating, you simply have to give him a lemon drop to keep him quiet, at least until the train starts. She decides that the best thing to do is simply to ignore him and not give him the slightest encouragement to become friendly. The child, therefore, picks her out immediately to be his buddy. For a time, after things get to going, all you have to do is answer questions about the scenery. This is only what you must expect when you have children, and it happens no matter where you are. You can always say that you don't know who lives in that house, or what that cow is doing. Sometimes you don't even have to look up when you say that you don't know. This part is comparatively easy. It is when the migratory fit comes on that you will be put to the test. Suddenly, you look and find the boy staggering down the aisle, peering into the faces of people as he passes them. "Here! Come back here, Roger!" you cry, lurching after him and landing across the knees of the young lady 2 seats down. Roger takes this as a signal for a game and starts to run, screaming with laughter. After 4 steps, he falls and starts to cry. On being carried, kicking, back to his seat, he is told that he mustn't run down the aisle again. This strikes even Roger as funny, because it is such a flat thing to say. Of course he is going to run down the aisle again, and he knows it as well as you do. In the meantime, however, he is perfectly willing to spend a little time with the lady in the black silk dress. "Here, Roger," you say. "Don't bother the lady." "Hello, little boy," the lady says, nervously, and tries to go back to her book. The interview is over as far as she is concerned. Roger, however, thinks that it would be just dandy to get up in her lap. This has to be stopped, and Roger has to be whispered to. He then announces that it is about time that he went to the washroom. You march down the car, steering him by the shoulders and both lurching together as the train takes the curves and attracting wide attention to your very obvious excursion. Several kindly people smile knowingly at you as you pass and try to pat the boy on the head, but their advances are repelled, it being a rule of all children to look with disfavor on any attentions from strangers. The only people they want to play with are those who hate children. On reaching the washroom, you discover that the porter has just locked it and taken the key with him. Simply to be nasty. This raises quite a problem. You explain the situation as well as possible, which turns out to be not well enough. There is every indication of loud crying and perhaps worse. You call attention to the landscape as it whirls by, which will serve to take the mind off the tragedy of the moment. You become so engrossed in this important task that it is some time before you discover that you are completely blocking the passageway and the progress of some 15 people who want to get off at Utica. There is nothing for you to do but head the procession and get off first. Once out in the open, The pride and prop of your old age decides that the thing to do is pay the engineer a visit and starts off up the platform at a terrific rate. This amuses the onlookers and gives you a little exercise after being cramped up in that old car all that morning. The imminent danger of the train starting without you only adds to the fun. At that, there might be worse things than being left in Utica. One of them is getting back on the train, again, to face the old gentleman with the large watch chain. The final phase of the ordeal, however, is still in store for you when you make your way, and Roger's way, into the diner. Here the plunging march down the aisle of the car is multiplied by 6. The diner is never any nearer than 6 cars, and usually is part of another train. On the way, Roger sees a box of animal crackers belonging to a little girl, and commandeers it. The little girl, putting up a fight, is promptly pushed over, starting what promises to be a free-for-all fight between the two families. Lurching along after the apologies have been made, it is just a series of unwarranted attacks by Roger on sleeping travelers, and equally unwarranted evasions by Roger of the kindly advances of very nice people who love children. In the diner, it turns out that the nearest thing they have to Roger's customary diet is veal cutlets, and you hardly think that his mother would approve of those. Everything else has peppers or sardines in it. A curry of lamb across the way strikes the boy's fancy, and he demands some of that. On being told that he has not the slightest chance in the world of getting it, but how would he like a little crackers and milk? He becomes quite upset and threatens to throw a fork at the Episcopal clergyman sitting opposite. Pieces of toasts are waved alluringly in front of him, and he is asked to consider the advantages of preserved figs and cream. But it is curry of lamb or he gets off the train. He doesn't act like this at home. In fact, he is noted for his tractability. There seems to be something about the train that brings out all the worst that is in him, all the hidden traits that he has inherited from his mother's side of the family. There is nothing else to do but say firmly, "Very well then, Roger. We'll go back without any nice dinner," and carry him, protesting, from the diner, apologizing to the head steward for the scene, and considering dropping him overboard as you pass through each vestibule. In fact, I had a cousin once who had to take 3 of his little ones on an all-day trip from Philadelphia to Boston. It was the hottest day of the year, and my cousin had on a woolen suit. By the time he reached Hartford, people in the car noticed that he had only 2 children with him. At Worcester, he had only 1. No one knew what had become of the others, and no one asked. It seemed better not to ask. He reached Boston alone, and never explained what had become of the tiny tots. Anyone who has ever traveled with tiny tots of his own, however, can guess. Robert Charles Benchley. Museum feet. A complaint contracted by overzealous parents. There is one big danger in the approach of autumn, and that is that the snappy weather may excite us into making plans for doing things we ought to have done long ago. Those of us who are parents are likely to decide that we haven't been paying enough attention to the children, that we ought to take them out more to places of interest and instruction. More of a pal than a father is what we feel we ought to be, and yet withal an instructor, steering them into enlightening byways and taking them on educational trips to fisheries and jute manufactories and so on. Now, This is just a manifestation of fall fever, and will die down. So don't give in to it. Let the children educate themselves. You haven't done such a swell job with yourself that you should undertake to show someone else how to do it. And above all, never take the kiddies to a natural history museum. Taking them to a natural history museum is one of the things a parent first feels coming on when the crisp autumn days send the blood tingling through his veins. And it's one of the last things he should do. I, myself, in a burst of parental obligation last fall, decided to take the boys through the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. I would have picked a bigger place if there had been one in the country, but the Smithsonian was the biggest I could get. As a result, I contracted a bad case of what is known in medical circles as Smithsonian feet. That is, a complete paralysis of the feet from the ankles down, due to standing on first one foot and then the other, in front of exhibition cases and walking miles upon miles up and down the tessellated corridors of the museum. The boys suffered no ill effects from the trip at all. The sad thing about a trip through a museum with the children is that you start out with so much vigor and zip. On entering the main entrance lobby, you call back Herbert, who takes a running slide across the smooth floor, and tell him that he must stay close to Daddy, and that Daddy will show him everything and explain everything. And what a sap that makes Daddy before the day is done. In your care not to miss anything, you stop and examine carefully the very first tablet in the entrance lobby, deciding to work to the left and look at everything on the left side of the building, and then take up the right side. "Look, boys," you say. "It says here that this building was built by the Natural Historic Society of America in 1876. Oh, well, I guess that isn't very important. And you ask the attendant at the door which is the most satisfactory way to see the museum. A foolish question at best. He tells you to begin with the Glacier Hall over there at the right. This upsets your plan a little, but what difference does it make whether you see the right or left side first? "Come on, boys," you call to both of them, who are now sliding back and forth on the floor. "Here is the room where the glaciers are. Come on and look at the glaciers." The boys by this time are very hot and sweaty, and probably less interested in glaciers than in anything else in the world. You, yourself, find nothing particularly thrilling about the rocks which are lined up for inspection in the room as you enter. However, it is a pretty important thing, this matter of glacial deposits, and both you and the boys would be better off for knowing a little something about them. "Look, Herbert," you say. "Look, Arthur! See here, where the glacier went right over this rock and left these big marks?" But Herbert is already in the next hall, which is devoted to stuffed rats, and Arthur has disappeared entirely. "Where's Arthur, Herbert?" you yell. "Look, Daddy," replies Herbert from across the hall. "Come here quick! Quick, Daddy!" There is evidently some danger that the stuffed rats are going to get away before you arrive, and you have to run to hush Herbert up, although you had much rather not look at stuffed rats. Arthur has, by this time, appeared several miles down the building in the early American Indian room and screams, "Come quick, Daddy! Oh, look! Indians!" So you and Herbert set off on a dog trot to the early American Indian room. "You boys must not yell so in here," you warn. "And stop running, Arthur. We've got all day." God forbid. "Where did these Indians live, Daddy?" asks Herbert. "Oh, Around Massachusetts, you explain. They fought the Pilgrims. It says here they lived in Arizona, reads Arthur. Whoever taught that boy to read anyway? Well, Arizona too, you crawl. They lived all over. What are these, Daddy? Those are hatchet heads. They used them for heads to their hatchets. It says here they're flint stones that they struck fire on. Flint stones, eh? Well, they're funny-looking flint stones. They must have used them for hatchet heads, too. What did they use these for, Daddy? If you can read so well, why don't you read what it says and not ask me so much? Where's Herbert? Herbert is now on the point of pushing over a little case of Etruscan bowls in an attempt to get at the figure of a Boeotian horse in the case behind it. Here, Herbert, don't push that like that. Do you want to break it? Yes, replies Herbert, giving you a short answer. Well, we'll go right straight home if you are going to act that way. Here, a good idea strikes you. Why not go right straight home and blame it on Herbert? The first evidences of Smithsonian feet are beginning to make themselves felt. You try walking on your ankles to favor the soles of your feet, but that doesn't help, and you haven't even struck the second floor yet. By actual count, the word "look" has been called out 82 times, and each time you have looked. 43 questions have been asked, 40 of which you have answered incorrectly, and 34 of which you have been caught answering incorrectly. It is high time that you did go home. But the boys are just beginning. They spot another room at the end of the wing and rush to it. You trail after them, all your old fire gone. It turns out to be the Glacier Hall again. We've been in here before, you say, hoping that this will discourage them. There's the door to the street over there. How about going home and coming again tomorrow? This suggestion is not even heard, for the boys are on their way up the big flight of stairs leading to the second floor. If you can make half the flight, you will be doing well. By the time you reach the first landing, you are in a state of collapse. Look, Daddy! You hear the little voices calling from above. Come quick, Daddy! Skeletons! And skeletons they are, sure enough. Mastodon skeletons. Herbert, turning the corner hurriedly, comes suddenly on one and is thrown into a panic. Not a bad idea. Perhaps they might both be frightened into wanting to go home. But nature herself comes to your rescue. At the end of the mastodon room, Herbert comes and whispers to you. I don't know, you reply hopefully. Perhaps we had better go home. No, screams Herbert. I want to stay here. Well, come along with me then, and we'll see if we can find it. Come on, Arthur. Come with Herbert and Daddy. So, on the pretext of locating the section of the building in question, you lead the boys downstairs and out the back way. Over here, I guess, you say. No, I guess over there. By this time, you are at the street and within hailing distance of a taxi. It is but the work of a minute to hit Herbert over the head until he is quiet, and to yank Arthur into the cab along with you. Drive, quickly, to 468 Elm Avenue, you say to the driver. That would be your home address.
I was freezing. My legs had turned to jelly, and my arms felt like they'd been stretched to twice their normal length. Even though I could not wait to get home, I had to concede defeat. Or rather, I had to take a break. The first two cafes I looked into were packed to the roof. It was market day after all. There appeared to be room in the third, and so I went in. Not the most impressive of places, I thought. but if it could provide me with a seat and a half-decent cup of tea, I'd be happy. It was self-service only, and there was a queue at the counter. I put the shopping bags down while I waited, groaning aloud with relief. How on earth could two people eat so much? Or had Marjorie, my wife, amused by the fact that it was I who would be buying the groceries that week, been a little over-eager with the shopping list? Whatever, it was the first and last time I would endure the slings and arrows of Tesco on the busiest day of the week. Next Thursday it would be down to Marjorie again. I'd no doubt she would be over the hip replacement op by then. Standing at the cafe counter, I became convinced I needed not just a hip, but a whole body replacement. A man with hairy arms came over and asked what I wanted. A cup of tea, I told him. Oh, and a Kit-Kat, 4 fingers, not 2. A minute later, a cup was banged onto the counter with such force that it wobbled and rattled on its saucer. Beside it was dropped the Kit-Kat. £1 5 the man muttered. I fished in my pocket for change. I was still wearing my gloves, but could not be bothered to take them off. Pulling out £2 coins, I handed them over and began to look round for a seat. Unfortunately, the place was a lot busier than I'd first thought. I held the Kit-Kat in my left hand and picked up the cup with my right. When the man slapped down the change, I was left with no way of transferring it from the counter to my pocket. My ability to grip more than one item at a time was hampered by my gloves. There was an impatient cough from behind, and I realised I was holding up the queue. I tutted loudly in response. Some people simply have no patience. Ignoring the flurry of angry whispers, I put the cup of tea back on the counter, took off the gloves and pushed them into my coat pocket. I grabbed the change and gripped the teacup again and walked away from the counter. The first part of my mission was accomplished, though I have to admit I was not in the most pleasant of moods by then. The cafe was hot and noisy and absolutely filled with smoke. There appeared to be no hope of finding a seat. Perhaps if I closed my eyes and concentrated hard enough, I could use telepathic suggestion to make someone really want to leave. Then again, probably not. I was left with no choice but to swallow my pride and share a table with a stranger. The most likely candidate was in the farthest corner, a table for 4 occupied by a grandmotherly type. Surely she wouldn't object. I weaved my way around the pushchairs and the coats draped over seats until I was there. "Do you mind if I join you?" I asked the old woman. She looked at me. Her head moved so quickly it could have been a twitch. I took it to mean no, she didn't mind. I sank gratefully into the seat. "Place is absolutely heaving," I offered, trying to be pleasant. The woman, though, was having none of it. She simply slurped at her own tea and stared rather vacantly at the wall behind me. "Never mind," I consoled myself. "You'll be out of here and home soon. And then you can tell Marjorie you will never, ever go shopping again." I suddenly went cold. The shopping! I had been so distracted at the counter that I had left the carrier bags on the floor. Anyone could walk off with them. I lunged out of my seat and zigzagged back across the cafe. Luckily they were still there. I picked them up and carted them over to my table. The old woman did not even blink at my return. Still, 2 could play at that game. I would make no further attempt at conversation. Instead, I simply sipped at my tea, picked up the Kit-Kat and began to unwrap it. I should explain that for years I've had a soft spot for the things. I even open them in the same methodical way, a minor eccentricity that drives Marjorie around the bend. So, first I took off the outer wrapper, which I folded over and over until it was the size of my thumbnail, and put it in the ashtray. I was amused to notice the old woman watching me. I sincerely hoped it irritated her as much as it did my wife. Next, I ran a fingernail along the edge of the foil until it could be peeled back, exposing the chocolate biscuit beneath. Finally, I exerted exactly the right amount of pressure to separate the 4 fingers without damaging them. By now, the old woman was staring openly at me. It was all I could do not to smile. I felt a ridiculous sense of victory, which vanished as the woman picked up a finger and ate it. I was too shocked to say anything. The nerve of it! Maybe she was upset I had invaded her cosy little corner. If that was the case, she should have said something. Instead, she had stolen part of my Kit-Kat. That was a declaration of war, and by God, I was ready for a fight. Looking her straight in the eye, I picked up the second finger and with deliberate slowness bit down on it. The woman's lip movement subconsciously matched my own as I began to chew. 1 all, I thought. She retaliated by snatching the third finger. By now I was beginning to wonder if she was not so much upset at me as a little soft in the head. Her actions, after all, were not those of one blessed with a full quota of marbles. Not that she looked mad, but appearances can be deceiving. I was prepared to give her the benefit of the doubt, to bite back any words of remonstration I may have been tempted to voice. If I could square the score, I would be happy to leave it at that. My eyes narrowed in concentration. The noise from around me faded away. The cafe seemed to shrink to a small circle of reality, containing only myself, the old woman, 2 cups of tea, and a finger of Kit-Kat. I licked my lips. My hand twitched in anticipation. I went to reach out, and the woman beat me to it. Only those who have witnessed the speed of a cobra's deadly strike could appreciate just how quickly she moved. One moment her hand was empty. A split second later, it held what remained of my biscuit. 3-1. Game over. I had to admit defeat, even though it had been my Kit-Kat. I could not bring myself to say anything to the old woman. I knew it was an utterly ridiculous situation to find myself in, but I supposed I was as much to blame as her. I should not have allowed myself to be drawn into such a childish confrontation. All I could do was finish my tea, which suddenly tasted bitter, and leave with what remained of my dignity. Before I could, the old woman stood, and fixing me with an enigmatic look, began to walk to the counter. I wondered what she was playing at. Surely she didn't want a rematch. Well, if she did, she'd had it. I would be gone from the cafe before she returned. That was the plan, and it would have worked had luck been on my side. As I reached for the carriers, one of them tipped over, discharging 2 tins of soup and a bottle of ketchup which rolled under the table. Cursing, I bent over to retrieve them. By the time I had returned them to the bag and straightened again, the woman was heading towards me, a plate gripped in one hand. No way, I thought. I'd had enough silly games for one day. Still, I could not resist a quick glance as she sat at the table and placed the plate in front of her. On it was a donut, one of those big, sugar-covered, jam-filled types that, like Kit-Kats, have always been a favourite of mine. I was overwhelmed by a temptation I swear I tried to resist, but which finally proved too strong. Even though the bags were heavy, I managed to lift them with one hand. I stood and casually walked round my opponent, my gaze fixed on the cafe door in case she looked at me. At the very last minute, my free hand shot out and grasped the donut. Before the woman could react, I sank my teeth into it, tearing off a chunk, then dropped what was left onto her plate. I straightened my shoulders and, licking jam and sugar from my lips, marched past the tables and chairs, out into the street. A few yards down the road, I stopped and allowed myself to smile. I'd had my revenge, and yes, it had been sweet. The day had not been a total disaster after all. I could return to Marjorie with my head held high. Despite my elation, I found myself shivering. The weather was turning cold again. I noticed it was starting to snow. Putting down the bags for a moment, I reached into my coat pocket for my gloves, which is when my fingers brushed against the Kit-Kat I had bought.
Robert Charles Benchley. Take the Witness. Newspaper accounts of trial cross-examinations always bring out the cleverest in me. They induce daydreams in which I am the witness on the stand. And if you don't know some of my imaginary comebacks to an imaginary cross-examiner, you have missed some of the most stimulating reading in the history of American jurisprudence. These little reveries usually take place shortly after I have read the transcript of a trial, while I am on a long taxi ride, or seated at a desk with plenty of other work to do. I like them best when I have work to do, as they deplete me mentally, so that I am forced to go and lie down after a particularly sharp verbal rally. The knowledge that I have completely floored my adversary, and the imaginary congratulations of my friends, also imaginary, seem more worthwhile than any amount of fiddling work done. During these cross-questionings, I am always very calm. Calm in a nice way, that is, never cocky. However frantic my inquisitor may wax, and you should see his face at times, it's purple, I just sit there, burning him up with each answer, winning the admiration of the courtroom, and at times, even a smile from the judge himself. At the end of my examination, the judge is crazy about me. Just what the trial is about, I never get quite clear in my mind. Sometimes the subject changes in the middle of the questioning, to allow the insertion of an especially good crack on my part. I don't think that I am ever actually the defendant, although I don't know why I should feel that I am immune from trial by a jury of my peers, if such exists. I am usually testifying on behalf of a friend, or perhaps as just an impersonal witness for someone I do not know, who, naturally, later becomes my friend for life. It is justice that I am after. Justice and a few well-spotted laughs. Let us whip right into the middle of my cross-examination, as I naturally wouldn't want to pull my stuff until I had been insulted by the lawyer, and you can't get insulted simply by having your name and address asked. I am absolutely fair about these things. If the lawyer will treat me right, I'll treat him right. He has got to start it. For a decent cross-examiner, there is no more tractable witness in the world than I am. Advancing towards me, with a sneer on his face, he points a finger at me. I have sometimes thought of pointing my finger back at him, but have discarded that as being too fresh. I didn't resort to clowning. Question. You think you are pretty funny, don't you? I have evidently just made some mildly humorous comeback, nothing smart alecky, but good enough to make him look silly. Answer. I have never given the matter much thought. Question. Oh, you haven't given the matter much thought, eh? Well, you seem to be treating this examination as if it were a minstrel show. Answer. Very quietly and nicely. I have merely been taking my cue from your questions. You will notice that all this presupposes quite a barrage of silly questions on his part, and pat answers on mine, omitted here because I haven't thought them up. At any rate, it is evident that I have already got him on the run before the reverie begins. Question. Perhaps you would rather that I concluded this inquiry in baby talk. Answer. If it will make it easier for you. Pandemonium, which the court feels that it has to quell, although enjoying it obviously as much as the spectators. Question. Furious. I see. Well, here is a question that I think will be simple enough to elicit an honest answer. Just how did you happen to know that it was 11:15 when you saw the defendant? Answer. Because I looked at my watch. Question. And just why did you look at your watch at this particular time? Answer. To see what time it was. Question. Are you accustomed to looking at your watch often? Answer. That is one of the uses to which I often put my watch. Question. I see. Now, it couldn't, by any chance, have been 10:15 instead of 11:15 when you looked at your watch this time, could it? Answer. Yes, sir, it could. Question. Oh! It could have been 10:15. Answer. Yes, sir, if I had been in Chicago. Not very good, really. I'll work up something better. I move to have that answer struck from the record. When I feel myself lowering my standards by answering like that, I usually give myself a rest. And unless something else awfully good pops into my head, I adjourn the court until next day. I can always convene it again when I hit my stride. If possible, however, I like to drag it out until I have really given my antagonist a big final wallop, which practically curls him up on the floor. I may think of one before this goes to press, and, wiping his forehead, he mutters, "Take the witness!" As I step down from the stand, fresh as a daisy, there is a round of applause, which the court makes no attempt to silence. In fact, I have known certain judges to wink pleasantly at me as I take my seat. Judges are only human, after all. My only fear is that, if ever I really am called upon to testify in court, I won't be asked the right questions. That would be a pretty kettle of fish. Gerald Durrell, Menagerie Manor. Most children at the tender age of 6 or so are generally full of the most impractical schemes for becoming policemen, firemen, or engine drivers when they grow up. But when I was that age, I could not be bothered with such mundane ambitions. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to have my own zoo. At the time, this did not seem to me, and still does not seem, a very unreasonable or outrageous ambition. My friends and relatives, who had long thought that I was mental owing to the fact that I have evinced no interest in anything that did not have fur, feathers, scales, or chitin, accepted this as just another manifestation of my weak state of mind. As the years passed, however, my resolve to have my own zoo grew greater and greater, and eventually, after going on a number of expeditions to bring back animals for other zoos, I felt the time was ripe to acquire my own. To complicate things, I did not want a simple, straightforward zoo with the ordinary run of animals. The idea behind my zoo was to aid in the preservation of animal life. This, it has always seemed to me, should be the function of any zoo, but it is only recently that the majority of zoos have woken up to this fact and tried to do anything about it. I wanted this to be the main function of my zoo. However, like all altruistic ideas, it was going to cost money. It was, therefore, obvious that the zoo would have to be run on purely commercial lines to begin with, unless it was self-supporting. Then one could start building up breeding stocks of rare creatures. As the zoo needs every form of publicity it can obtain, television was clearly one of the best mediums, and so I tried to popularize it by this means whenever possible. A television producer once said to me that if he could produce a program without a television personality or professional actor, he would be a happy man. I could see his point, but he did not know that there could be something infinitely more harrowing than putting on a program with a television personality or professional actor. He had never undertaken one with live, wild animals. The difficulties of this making the strutting and fretting of television personalities and actors fade into insignificance. When making a program with animals, they either behave so badly that you are left a jittering mass of nerves in the end, or else they behave so well that they steal the show. Whichever way it is, you cannot win, and anyone, in my considered opinion, who undertakes to do such a job should be kindly and firmly conducted by his friends to the nearest mental home. If you let him do the program, he will end there anyway, so you are merely anticipating. One of the first programs I did was devoted to the primates, or monkey family, of which the zoo boasted a rather fine collection. For the first time, live, on television, I could show the great British public a splendid array of creatures ranging from the tiny, large-eyed bush babies, through the lorises, the old and New World monkeys, to the gorilla and chimpanzee, with myself thrown in as an example of Homo sapiens. I had no qualms about this. The monkeys and apes were all extremely tame. The bush babies would be confined in glass-fronted cases, and the lorises would be on upright branches where, I knew, they would simply curl up and sleep until awakened by me during the program. At least, that is how it should have worked. But unfortunately, I had not taken into consideration the effects of the journey, for the island of Jersey is an hour's flying time from the city of Bristol, where the program was to be recorded. By the time the animals had been crated, flown to Bristol, and unloaded in the dressing room, which had been put at their disposal, they were all in a highly neurotic state of mind. So was I. When the time for the first rehearsal approached, all the monkeys had to be removed from their traveling crates, have belts and leashes attached to them, and tethered, one to each compartment, on a construction that resembled a miniature cow stall. The monkeys, hitherto always tame, placid, and well-behaved, took one look at the cow stall, and had what appeared to be a collective nervous breakdown. They screamed, they bit, they struggled. One broke the leash and disappeared behind some piled scenery from which he was extracted, yelling loudly and covered with cobwebs after about half an hour's concentrated effort. Already, rehearsal was 15 minutes overdue. At last, we had them all in position and more or less quiet. I apologized to the producer and said that we would be ready in next to no time, for all we had to do was put the lorises on their respective tree trunks, and this, with such lethargic animals, would be the work of a moment. We opened the cage doors, expecting to have it chivvy the sleepy lorises out onto their trees. But instead they stalked out like a couple of racehorses, their eyes blazing with indignation, uttering loud cat-like cries of disgust and warning. Before anyone could do anything sensible, they had rushed down their tree trunks and were roaring across the studio floor, their mouths open, their eyes wide. Technicians departed hurriedly in all directions, except a few of the bolder ones who, with rolled-up newspapers as weapons, endeavored to prevent the determined lorises from getting among the scenery, as the monkey had done. After further considerable delay, we managed to return the lorises to their traveling crates, and the props department was hurriedly summoned to attach to the bottom of each tree a cardboard cone that would prevent the creatures from getting a grip and so climbing down on the floor. Rehearsals were now an hour overdue. At last, we were underway, and by this time I was in such a state of nerves that the rehearsal was a shambles. I forgot my lines. I called most of the animals by the wrong names. The slightest sound made me jump out of my skin for fear something had escaped. And to cap it all, Lulu the chimp urinated copiously, loudly, and with considerable interest in her own achievement, all over my lap. We all retired to lunch with black circles under our eyes, raging headaches, and a grim sense of foreboding. The producer, with a ghastly smile, said she was sure it would be all right, and I, trying to eat what appeared to be fried sawdust, agreed. We went back to the studio to do the recording. The red light went on, and with shaking hands I took a deep breath, smiled the tremulous smile at the camera as if I loved it like a brother, and commenced. To my surprise, the monkeys behaved perfectly. My confidence started to return. The bush babies were wonderful, and I felt a faint ray of hope. We reached the Lorises, and they were magnificent. My voice lost its tremolo and, I hoped, took on a firm, manly, authoritative note. I was getting into my stride. Just as I began speaking about the protective postures of a potto, believe it or not, the studio manager came over and told me that there had been a breakdown in the telerecording and we should have to start all over again. Of course, after an experience like this, one is mental to even try to do any more television. But I had agreed to do 5 more. The 5 I did, I must admit, were not quite as trying as the monkey program, but some of the highlights still live vividly in my memory, and occasionally I awake screaming in the night and have to be comforted by Jackie. There was, for example, the program I did on birds. The idea was to assemble as many different species as possible and show how their beaks were adapted for their varying ways of life. 2 of the birds were to be star terns, because they ding to order. There was, for instance, Dingle, the chough. This member of the crow family is extremely rare in Great Britain now, and we are very lucky to have him. They are clad in funereal black feathering, but with scarlet feet, and a long, curved scarlet beak. Dingle, who had been hand-reared, was absurdly tame. The second star was a cockatoo named, with incredible originality by its previous owner, Cocky. Now, this creature would, when requested, put up its amazing crest and shout loudly, a most impressive sight. All the other birds taking part in the program did nothing at all. They were all, very sensibly, content to just sit there and be themselves. So, my only problems were Dingle and Cocky, and I had great faith in both of them. The program was to open with me standing there, Dingle perched on my wrist, while I talked about him. During rehearsals, this worked perfectly, for if you scratch Dingle's head, he goes off into a trance-like state and remains quite still. However, when it came to the actual recording, Dingle decided that he had been scratched enough, and just as the red light went on, he launched himself off my wrist and flew up into the rafters of the studio. It took us half an hour with the aid of ladders and bribes in the shape of meat and cheese, of which he is inordinately fond, to retrieve him, whereupon he behaved perfectly, and sat so still on my wrist that he appeared to be stuffed. All went smoothly until we came to Cocky. Here, I made the mistake of telling my audience what to expect, which is the one thing not to do with animals. So, while 5 million viewers gaped expectantly waiting to see Cocky put up his crest and scream, I made desperate attempts to persuade him to do it. This went on for 5 soul-searing minutes, while Cocky just sat on his perch as immobile as a museum specimen. In despair, I eventually moved on to the next bird, and as I did so, Cocky erected his crest and screamed mockingly. And there was another program, devoted to Delilah. I thought she would be a very good example of the way an animal protects itself, and certainly she showed this off to advantage. When we came to put her into the crate, she charged wildly in all directions, backing into us and the woodwork, and leaving spines embedded in the sides of the crate and in the ends of the brushes. She roared and rattled her quills throughout the trip to Bristol, and the studio hands, who unloaded her on arrival there, were for some considerable time under the impression that I had brought a fully grown leopard with me. Then, we had to transfer Delilah from her traveling box and into the special studio cage that had been built for her. This took half an hour, and by the time we had achieved it, Delilah had stuck so many quills into so much of the studio scenery that I began to wonder whether she would be completely bald for her debut on television. During the actual transmission, she behaved, to my amazement, perfectly, doing all the things that I wanted. She roared fearsomely. She stamped her feet and rattled her quills like castanets, as though she were a born television star. By the end of the show, I was feeling quite friendly towards her, and beginning to think that I might well have misjudged her. Then came the moment of inducing her out of the studio cage, back into her travelling crate. It took 8 of us 3/4 of an hour. One stagehand received a sharp stab in the calf of his leg. 2 pieces of scenery were irretrievably damaged, and the entire set was pierced so full of porcupine quills, it looked as though we had been fighting off a Red Indian attack. I was thankful to get a by then quill-less Delilah back to the zoo and into her own cage again. I suppose that the terrible things that occur tend to live in one's memory more vividly than the pleasant happenings, and so I look back on the television shows I have done with animals rather in the way that one remembers a nasty series of accidents. There is, however, one incident on which I look back with extreme pleasure, and that was the occasion when the BBC wanted our young gorilla, Napongo, to take part in a program. They even went to the unprecedented lengths of chartering a small plane to fly us over to Bristol. They also sent a cameraman to cover the trip with his camera, a timid individual who confessed to me that he did not like flying, as it made him sick. We took off in brilliant sunshine, and almost immediately dived into black cloud filled to capacity with air pockets. Napongo, sitting back in his seat like a seasoned traveller, thoroughly enjoyed everything. He accepted 6 lumps of barley sugar to counteract the popping in his ears, peered with interest and excitement out of the window, and when the air pockets began, he fetched out the sick bag and put it on his head. The poor photographer had become progressively greener while attempting to film Napongo's antics. But when he put the bag on his head, this reminder acted in a devastating way, and he dived for his own receptacle and treated it in the way for which it was designed.
Incidentally, the cat made a mess under the dining table, said Mrs. Bell to her daughter-in-law. So what with poor little Timmy sobbing for his mother and next door's music blasting through the wall, I realised that my stamina is no longer quite what it was. "I'm awfully sorry," Belinda panted. She wrenched off her jacket and dumped it on the floor. "Oh, how naughty of them both. I cleaned up the mess, and Timmy is bathed and bedded," continued Mrs. Bell. "I gave him cornflakes. I hope that was right, but you left me no instructions, dear. I read him a little piece from the Times obituary column. Well, at his age, it's the sound of the human voice that counts. And I reassured him that Mummy was coming back. She was merely a little late." "I'm sorry," Belinda repeated. "The time just flew. Can I pour us a drink or something?" "No, thank you, dear," replied Mrs. Bell, putting on her coat and taking up her handbag. "Perhaps you would just run me home straight away." "Oh, God," Belinda said very quietly. "I don't know how to tell you this, but I've run out of petrol. I had to leave the car in Hawthorne Avenue. Honestly, I'd no idea the tank was so low." Mrs. Bell heaved a sigh that raised her bosom a good 3 inches. She closed her eyes, seeking patience, but none came. It had been a long, hard day. "Dear," she said, with her eyes still closed, "you are a very sweet girl in your way. Oh, but you are incompetent, inconsiderate, and inconceivably muddle-headed. Apart from your pretty face and rather waif-like charm, I consider you, in short, to be an utter and complete dead loss. I'm sorry. You cannot cook, apart from warming things in a microwave. You never sweep or dust. I could write my name on the coffee table, and yet you never have time for anything, not even for this poor plant that I gave you." Mrs. Bell bent to insert an index finger in the large plant pot standing on the hall floor. "Look, dry as a bone." "We call her Gertie," Belinda said faintly. "I prefer to think of it as a Ficus benjamina. You may remember that I grew it especially for you." "I'm sorry," Belinda suddenly bawled. "I keep on saying I'm sorry. Whenever we meet, I have to keep saying I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Sorry for this, sorry for that, like a silly sort of machine." "Don't shout, dear. I was merely pointing out that—" "Well, don't bother. Just bear in mind that your darling son likes microwaved food, that we both adore having dust on our coffee table, and if that's how you feel, you can take a blasted plant home with you." "Thank you," said Mrs. Bell. "I will be glad to. Perhaps you will kindly open the door." Readjusting her shoulder bag so that it hung from her neck, she gave Belinda a flinty goodbye smile. "But you can't, really. I mean, it's too—" Belinda fell silent. "Just open the door and then close it behind me." Belinda did so, and Mrs. Bell clasped the plant pot in her arms and staggered out into the street. They had never got on, not really. They both tried, of course, and would no doubt continue to do so, but they never seemed able to progress beyond a wary suspicion of one another. The fact that Mrs. Bell only ever addressed Belinda as "dear," and that Belinda could rise to nothing more personal than "you," just about said it all. A pity, thought Mrs. Bell for the umpteenth time, but there it is. It was dark now, and rather cold. Still warm with exasperation, it took her several minutes to fully appreciate the situation in which she now found herself. Alone and tired, and carrying a plant pot of heroic proportions. Its topmost branches swayed and bobbed above her head, and its width was greatly in excess of her own. Seen from the opposite direction, she was no more than a Ficus benjamina on legs. "I must get a taxi," she thought, and peered hopefully through the foliage. 2 passed her already engaged, and the 3rd hastily accelerated at the sight of being flagged down by a mobile tree. There was nothing for it but to walk, and Mrs. Bell thought longingly of her son, who would have driven her home like a shot if only he hadn't been travelling abroad for his firm. Fresh indignation filled her at the thought of the silly girl he had married. Only she could be silly enough to call an ornamental fig Gertie. She staggered on, with a pain beginning to gnaw her spine and her arms aching. There were few people about, and those who passed turned to look at her with curiosity. 2 teenagers even sniggered. Almost on the point of setting the plant pot down for a moment's rest, she suddenly remembered that a little further on, where the common began, there was a public bench. Breathing hard, she managed to reach it. It was unoccupied, and she sank down with the plant pot at her feet. It then occurred to her for the first time that she could never have taken a taxi anyway. The plant was far too big to go inside. Might as well try to take it on a bus, she thought with grim humour. Oh, never mind. I'm almost halfway home now. Lost in her own thoughts, she failed to notice the man who appeared out of the shadows until he seated himself beside her. Faintly alarmed, Mrs. Bell shifted slightly so that their elbows no longer touched. "Oh, my word," the man murmured. "What a beautiful, beautiful exhibit." He leaned forward and touched one of the leaves with reverent fingers. "Unless I'm very much mistaken, it's a Ficus benjamina." "My late husband was a very keen plantsman," Mrs. Bell heard herself saying some 10 minutes later. "His speciality was pelargoniums." "Really?" said the man. He turned to face her, and in the shadowy light she became aware of a thin, rather aesthetic face wearing a gentle expression. He was not young, for there were lines at the corner of his eyes, and the hair, visible from beneath the old-fashioned trilby hat, looked as if it might be turning grey. There was a quiet elegance about him that rather pleased her. "I had a Benjamina once," he said. "I tried repeatedly to take cuttings from it, but all in vain." "Cuttings?" said Mrs. Bell. "Oh, no wonder. The more common figs can be increased by cuttings, certainly, but the Benjamina must be air-layered." The man removed his attention from the plant in front of them and turned to gaze at her again. "Oh," he said softly, "I had no idea." "Air-layering isn't easy," went on Mrs. Bell, "and I don't recommend it to the amateur. But in a nutshell, it means the method that is used to stimulate root development without the stem being in contact with the potting agent. By that I mean the compost." "Oh, my word," said the man. "I'm not sure I could ever rise to skills like that." "Oh, of course you could," said Mrs. Bell perversely. "Once upon a time I was unable to grow anything but mustard and cress." "But it's such a beautiful specimen," the man breathed. They fell silent, watching the occasional glint of car lights through the finely cut foliage. "Gertie," thought Mrs. Bell with a shudder, and wondered whether she should begin to explain the technique of air-layering in more detail. An upward slanting cut with a sharp knife, the insertion of a piece of matchstick to hold the cut open while you... No. Instead, she surprised herself by saying that if he really wanted one, she would propagate a specimen for him herself. "Oh, I couldn't possibly put you to all that trouble," he breathed gratitude at her through delicate nostrils. "Give me your address, and you may have it in about 3 months' time," said Mrs. Bell. "In the meanwhile, I must be getting home." She stood up, stamping her chilled feet, then bent to retrieve the plant pot. But the man was faster. He stood clasping the ficus to his chest. "Oh, I couldn't possibly allow you to carry such a heavy thing," he said. "You lead the way and I'll follow." 2 thoughts crossed Mrs. Bell's mind. The first concerned the man's quite extraordinary kindness, and the second, a little more ignoble, wondered whether it would entail having to ask him in for a cup of coffee. It was very late, and she was not in the habit of asking strange men into her home, no matter what time it was, and no matter how nice they appeared. "Please, I can manage it quite easily." "No problem," cried the man gaily, and as if to prove the point began to stride rapidly in the direction she indicated. He was taller than she realised, with long legs ending in soundless, spongy-looking shoes. He drew ahead of her. "Wait," she called. "I'm afraid I can't keep up." Without replying, he increased his long, loping stride. The distance between them widened, and Mrs. Bell began to run, a little breathless, tottering run with her handbag bouncing against her bosom. She caught sight of the ficus Benjamina, waving and fluttering imploringly from the man's arms. "Come back! Come back!" Her voice echoed eerily in the night-time street. Passers-by seemed to have disappeared, and there was only the silently fleeing figure in the distance. A moment more, and he too had disappeared. Mrs. Bell abandoned the pursuit and turned, weeping, for home. Although the heating was on, she felt cold, so cold. Tiredness clogged her muscles, while shock still fogged her mind. Confusedly she set about warming a bowl of soup, then abandoned it. She felt too sickened to eat or drink. Instead, she immersed herself in a hot bath and then climbed into bed with her electric blanket turned up to number 8. But warm at last, she still couldn't sleep. The endless stupidities of Belinda collided with the cynical perfidy of the man who had chatted her up with the sole intention of stealing the ficus Benjamina. Having to admit in the lonely darkness that you have finally lost all faith in the human race is not pleasant. To be quite honest, even her own son was not always entirely beyond reproach, and so she tossed and sighed until 5:30, when at last she fell into a heavy sleep. She was awoken by someone ringing the doorbell. Dazzled by the stream of winter sunlight falling across the bed, she fumbled for dressing gown and slippers and made her way groggily downstairs. Belinda was standing there. Belinda, smiling her beguiling waif smile. "I'm sorry I was rude to you yesterday," she said, and proffered something wrapped round in a scroll of florist's flowery paper. Peering, Mrs. Bell saw a small plant nestled inside it. A small, very small, Ficus benjamina, with 2 little leafed branchlets held out to her like arms imploring sanctuary. "Oh, my dear," said Mrs. Bell, greatly moved. "There was really no need. I thought you'd like it. Oh, I do indeed. Now, come in and have some coffee." "I'd love to, but I'd better not. I've left Timmy with my friend next door." Belinda backed away. She reached the gate, then sidled back again. "By the way," she said diffidently, "I don't want to be a nuisance, but please could I have Gertie back?"
Gerald Durrell. The Picnic. In the summer, when the moon was full, the family took to bathing at night, for during the day the sun was so fierce that the sea became too hot to be refreshing. For some time Mother had greatly envied us our swimming, both in the daytime and at night, but, as she pointed out when we suggested she join us, she was far too old for that sort of thing. Eventually, however, under constant pressure from us, Mother paid a visit into town and returned to the villa coyly bearing a mysterious parcel. Opening this, she astonished us all by holding up an extraordinary shapeless garment of black cloth, covered from top to bottom with hundreds of frills and pleats and tucks. "Well, what do you think of it?" Mother asked. We stared at the odd garment and wondered what it was for. "What is it?" asked Larry at length. "It's a bathing costume, of course," said Mother. "What on earth did you think it was?" "It looks to me like a badly skinned whale," said Larry, peering at it closely. "You can't possibly wear that, Mother," said Margot, horrified. "Why, it looks as though it was made in 1920. "What are all those frills and things for?" asked Larry with interest. "Decoration, of course," said Mother indignantly. "What a jolly idea! Don't forget to shake the fish out of them when you come out of the water." "Well, I like it anyway," Mother said firmly, wrapping the monstrosity up again, "and I'm going to wear it." "You'll have to be careful you don't get waterlogged with all that cloth around you," said Leslie seriously. "Mother, it's awful. You can't wear it," said Margot. "Why on earth didn't you get something more up to date?" "When you get to my age, dear, you can't go around in a 2-piece bathing suit. You don't have the figure for it." "I'd love to know what sort of figure that was designed for," remarked Larry. "You really are hopeless, Mother," said Margot despairingly. "But I like it, and I'm not asking you to wear it," Mother pointed out belligerently. "That's right. You do what you want to do," agreed Larry. "Don't be put off." Mother snorted indignantly and swept upstairs to try on her costume. Presently, she called us to come and see the effect, and we all trooped up to the bedroom. Roger was the first to enter, and on being greeted by this strange apparition clad in its voluminous black costume rippling with frills, he retreated hurriedly through the door, backwards, barking ferociously. It was some time before we could persuade him that it really was Mother, and even then he kept giving her vaguely uncertain looks from the corner of his eye. However, in spite of all opposition, Mother stuck to her tent-like bathing suit, and in the end we gave up. In order to celebrate her first entry into the sea, we decided to have a moonlight picnic down at the bay, and sent an invitation to Theodore, who was the only stranger that Mother would tolerate on such a great occasion. The day for the great immersion arrived. Food and wine were prepared. The boat was cleaned out and filled with cushions, and everything was ready when Theodore turned up. On hearing that we had planned a moonlight picnic and swim, he reminded us that on that particular night there was no moon. Everyone blamed everyone else for not having checked on the moon's progress, and the argument went on until dusk. Eventually, we decided that we would go on the picnic in spite of everything, since all the arrangements were made. So we staggered down to the boat, loaded down with food, wine, towels, and cigarettes, and set off down the coast. Theodore and I sat in the bows as lookouts, and the rest took it in turn to row while Mother steered. To begin with, her eyes not having become accustomed to the dark, Mother skillfully steered us in a tight circle, so that after 10 minutes' strenuous rowing the jetty suddenly loomed up and we ran into it with a splintering crash. Unnerved by this, Mother went to the opposite extreme and steered out to sea, and we would eventually have made a landfall somewhere on the Albanian coastline if Leslie had not noticed in time. After this, Margot took over the steering, and she did it quite well, except that she would, in a crisis, get flurried and forget that to turn right one had to put the tiller over to the left. The result was that we had to spend 10 minutes straining and tugging at the boat which Margot had, in her excitement, steered onto instead of away from a rock. Taken all round, it was an auspicious start to Mother's first bathe. Eventually, we reached the bay, spread out the rugs on the sand, arranged the food, placed the battalion of wine bottles in a row in the shallows to keep cool, and the great moment had arrived. Amid much cheering, Mother removed her housecoat and stood revealed in all her glory, clad in the bathing costume which made her look, as Larry pointed out, like a sort of marine Albert Memorial. Roger behaved very well, until he saw Mother wade into the shallow water in a slow and dignified manner. He then got terribly excited. He seemed to be under the impression that the bathing costume was some sort of sea monster that had enveloped Mother, and was now about to carry her out to sea. Barking wildly, he flung himself to the rescue, grabbed one of the frills dangling so plentifully round the edge of the costume, and tugged with all his strength in order to pull Mother back to safety. Mother, who had just remarked that she thought the water a little cold, suddenly found herself being pulled backwards. With a squeak of dismay she lost her footing and sat down heavily in 2 feet of water, while Roger tugged so hard that a large section of the frill gave way. Elated by the fact that the enemy appeared to be disintegrating, Roger, growling encouragement to Mother, set to work to remove the rest of the offending monster from her person. We writhed on the sand, helpless with laughter, while Mother sat gasping in the shallows, making desperate attempts to regain her feet, beat Roger off, and retain at least a portion of her costume. Unfortunately, owing to the extreme thickness of the material from which the costume was constructed, the air was trapped inside. The effect of the water made it inflate like a balloon, and trying to keep this airship of frills and tucks under control added to Mother's difficulties. In the end, it was Theodore who shooed Roger away and helped Mother to her feet. Eventually, after we had partaken of a glass of wine to celebrate and recover from what Larry referred to as Perseus's rescue of Andromeda, we went in to swim, and Mother sat discreetly in the shallows, while Roger crouched nearby, growling ominously at the costume as it bulged and fluttered round Mother's waist.
I'm constantly amazed at the brazen effrontery of criminals who appear before this bench and attempt to excuse their gross and flagrant lack of respect for the rule of law by asking us to believe stories that a 5-year-old would deride as incredible. And today we have been asked by you, Mr. Farley, to accept that your presence in your unfortunate victim's dining room at 2 o'clock in the morning was the result of a telephone call from a third party, whom you cannot produce, requesting that you take part in a challenge for a popular television program that doesn't exist. The fact that you have produced this insultingly unlikely tale as evidence of a lack of criminal intent on your part convinces us not of your innocence, but merely that you are foolish as well as felonious. We would normally be disposed to accept arguments from your counsel that a first offence of this kind should be dealt with by a probation order or community service. However, your unrepentant stance, as evidenced by your singularly childish and persistent denials of guilt, convinces us that a custodial sentence is more appropriate in this case. You will go to prison for 12 months. Leslie Ormerod Stacker sat back and looked around the courtroom with that expression on his face which many others in the past had found so infuriating. It at the same time indicated smug satisfaction in a job well done, and challenged any liberal do-gooders to defy his God-given moral right to deliver this particular short, sharp shock to the dejected Farley. The 2 female magistrates who sat either side of him looked intently at their papers. Mrs. Bagot had suggested that she had found his excuse mildly entertaining in an otherwise dreary procession of wrongdoers, but she was a Liberal Democrat, thought Leslie dismissively, consigning her along with Greens, hippies, and even the Salvation Army to that soft underbelly of society, the insipid and well-meaning who were obstacles to the restoration of decency, order, and discipline. Thankfully, Mrs. Deakin Brown was more impressed by Leslie's arguments, particularly as she was anxious to jump the queue in the waiting list to join the golf club, of which Leslie was the honorary president. The fact that Mr. Bagot's dahlias had beaten Mr. Deakin Brown's to second place in the South Surrey Flower and Produce Show did not, of course, affect her decision to support Leslie Stacker. After a stunned pause, Farley erupted, "But it's the truth, I tell you. They said if I did it, we could win a holiday with the kids in Torremolinos, you miserable bleed—" Mercifully for his chances of avoiding a further period of incarceration for contempt of court, his description of Leslie Stacker was cut short by the heavy clang as the door to the subterranean cells heralded a trip to somewhere arguably less beguiling than Torremolinos, although the arresting officer was heard to murmur words to the effect that he'd been to Torremolinos and knew where he'd rather be going right now. The food and company were likely to be better in the nick, not to mention the view, and Spanish telly was terrible, all in ruddy Spanish. Honestly, these crims, they didn't know when they were well off, and at least the wife's sister wouldn't be giving him constant grief about not helping the wife with the kids, and it being her holiday too. Some hours later, Bill Farley was contemplating the cell which he was to call home for the next few months. His cellmate was relishing the opportunity to share with his dazed companion the love of animals and taxidermy which had led him to purloin people's cherished pets in order to immortalize them in his extensive collection. The other prisoners had long since lost patience with Paxo Gudge. His tendency to elaborate on the finer points of his hobby as the beef stew was being ladled onto their plates was not a characteristic that endeared him to them. Paxo had been caught red-handed. It was rumoured that the police dog accompanying the officer who arrested him had not yet recovered from the emotional trauma of greeting another German shepherd in the traditional manner and finding itself sniffing formaldehyde, rather than the expected exciting new variation of an intimate canine aroma. At the same time as, 500 miles away, Bill Farley was digesting information about the delicacy of touch demanded by the formidable challenge of a deceased Chihuahua, Leslie Stacker was settling into more salubrious accommodation in the Claymore Hotel in Inverness. But it would have been no consolation to the incarcerated Bill to know that Leslie, too, was not overjoyed at the situation he had found himself in. He was reluctantly attending a 3-day seminar for lay JPs on sentencing policy. He'd noticed with considerable chagrin that one of the speakers was to address them on the role played by inappropriate custodial sentencing in the creation of a recidivist criminal subclass. He'd allowed himself the luxury of a rare half-smile when it had occurred to him that he would prefer to deliver a lecture himself on the incidence of pickpockets reoffending after amputation of the hand. Leslie was proud of his sense of humour. "Just my little joke," was one of his favourite sayings. But he had arrived in Inverness to find that the convention hotel had been overbooked, and he'd have to be accommodated elsewhere. His displeasure was intensified when, on arrival at the other hotel, he discovered it to be a modern, impersonal, multi-story monster which was hosting a fantasy science fiction convention during the period that he would be there. The foyer was seething with semi-clad girls in greasy makeup and enthusiastic young men in ill-fitting Star Trek uniforms. Not that Leslie knew the source of the inspiration for the costumes. He didn't believe that television had contributed anything useful to society that couldn't have been achieved by healthy exercise and regular visits to the public lending library. Leslie negotiated the corridors teeming with alien life, all desperate to be seen and admired by their peers, and therefore constantly moving with pretended purpose around the hotel. He closed the door on room 7143 with a sigh of relief. His suitcase was due to follow him from his original convention hotel, along with those of the other handful of delegates who had been obliged to transfer to the Claymore. He availed himself of the services of the tea-making equipment and ate the small packet of rich tea biscuits and the chocolate mint that had been placed upon his pillow, despite finding the juxtaposition of the potentially messy chocolate and the crisp white pillow a trifle irksome. When his case failed to appear, after what he considered to be a reasonable time, Leslie telephoned the reception desk to complain. He was told that somehow it had been mistakenly placed on the last train to Edinburgh with the luggage of a bishop, who would doubtless realise the error on arriving at his destination and, being a man of undoubted probity, would arrange for its prompt return. They would then arrange for its delivery to his room before breakfast, and was there anything they could do in the meantime? Could they perhaps provide him with a complimentary bottle of their house wine from the restaurant? Leslie curtly dismissed their offer and decided to retire. At least the ensuite bathroom provided sufficient facilities to enable him to do so, feeling clean enough to slip under the unaccustomed duvet without the usual security of his sensible winceyette pyjamas between himself and the sheets. In the small hours of the morning he woke, as he usually did if he made the mistake of consuming too much tea before retiring. Half asleep, he followed the route he usually took to visit his bathroom at home in Guildford. As the door clicked shut behind him, he realised that he was standing, stark naked, in the corridor. He quickly turned and tried to open the door again, despite knowing with a sickening certainty that without that ridiculous piece of plastic he'd been given on checking in, he was not going to be able to get back into his room. He was right. Thoughts whirled through the fog of his rapidly clearing brain. How was he to regain access to his room without the embarrassment of being seen stark naked by whichever hotel employee came to let him in? How was he to summon assistance anyway? He could hardly take the lift down to reception, and if he knocked on another guest's door, how would they react to the sight of an unclad man with his bony hands clasped over his genitals? They wouldn't even wait to hear his explanation. How could he get to a telephone without being seen? Before he could begin to come to grips with the full impossible horror of his position, the sound of excited voices approaching the junction at the top of the corridor drove him to scurry inelegantly towards a door marked Emergency Stairs. He made a truly bizarre sight. He was a tall man, and his slenderness accentuated his height. The neat white goatee beard which he sported lent him an even more ridiculous air. He looked like nothing less than a demented great goblin from a Hans Christian Andersen story as he skittered along the corridor with a jerky stooping gait. He had to escape before he was spotted, and wanted to protect his modesty and what remained of his dignity. He gained the sanctuary of the concrete stairwell just in time to avoid being seen by 5'2" Darth Vader and his girlfriend Morgan Le Fay. The incongruousness of the appearance of these two characters didn't trouble their impersonators, an unemployed electrician and a care assistant from Leicester. An uncharitable outsider might feel tempted to observe that the real Morgan Le Fay would probably not have gained such a prodigious reputation as an irresistible enchantress had she been quite as massive as her 20th century impersonator, and furthermore would probably have been less inclined to allow cleavage to dominate all her other undoubted qualities quite so comprehensively. These uncharitable thoughts didn't, however, occupy Leslie. He had more important things to think about. He had to find a telephone. He descended to the next floor and cautiously opened the door into an identical corridor to that on the 7th floor he had just left. Similarly, the 6th and 5th floors offered no solace, as a rising panic began to make his heart hammer uncomfortably in his throat. He was getting further and further away from his room, which he now saw as the only point of safety in a frightening and dangerous world. He realized that the likeliest spot to find a telephone, without the risk of being seen before he could summon assistance, was the basement. As he passed the door to each floor on the way down, he was constantly made aware that there were still many residents roaming the corridors. Distant laughter and bursts of artificial laser fire mingled with electronically distorted voices to remind Leslie that he was in imminent danger of the most unwelcome experience in what he, at least, regarded as his hitherto entirely blameless life. After several heart-stoppingly close calls, he reached the deserted hinterland of the service areas of the basement and saw a sight comparable in his predicament to an oasis to a parched traveller in a desert. A glorious Bakelite telephone attached to the wall beside a row of aluminium trolleys bearing stacks of clean crockery. As he grasped the handset with relief, a pair of doors burst open, and 2 alien monsters came through, firing bursts of staccato electronic fire back into the room they had left, to the accompaniment of cheers of encouragement from those within. Before the revellers could turn and behold the unlikely sight of the crouching, naked, and horrified Justice of the Peace, churchwarden, and founder member of the Guildford Guardians of Decency, Leslie had ducked into an open doorway. He found himself in a storeroom, which was the temporary repository of assorted artifacts, weapons, and other items belonging to the convention organisers, including a Cyberman costume and a Dalek. Under normal circumstances, Leslie would rather have died than assume either of these guises, but at this moment the role of a Cyberman seemed a very attractive alternative to his present vulnerable situation. All he had to do was clamber into the costume, walk to the front desk, explain the situation, and have the porter readmit him to his room. He lifted the silver-painted Wellington boots off the rubberized and tube-encrusted boiler suit, but before he could pick it up, he heard one of the 2 gun-toting aliens outside say, "Come on, Brian, let's get the stuff up to the main room. Andrew'll do his nut if it's not all set up for the opening ceremonies in the morning. I don't fancy doing it at the crack of dawn." Leslie's instinct for survival drove him to make his next big mistake. Still clutching the silver gumboots, he climbed inside the Dalek and pulled the hinged-domed lid down over his head. Later, when going over the sequence of events, he realized that if anyone might have been likely to accept his story and sympathize with his plight, it would have been these 2 young men who evidently inhabited a world where nude men skulking furtively in basements wouldn't perhaps excite the same reaction as they undoubtedly would in Leslie's world. However, these thoughts came later. Leslie was now naked, clutching a pair of rubber boots, and was being wheeled through the still busy foyer of an hotel in the small hours of the morning by 2 alien monsters. As he passed out of the reception area, he thought of shouting out for help, but could imagine the likely reaction of the young girl behind the counter and the dozen or so people sprawled chatting in groups around the low tables. The Dalek was pushed by the young men across the car park and formal garden in front of the hotel and into the conference centre some 100 or so yards from the main building. Half an hour later, he was alone in the main hall, inside a Dalek, and heard the night porter incongruously assuring 2 alien monsters that the room would be securely locked until they came and requested it to be opened in the morning. Leslie climbed out of the Dalek and frantically searched the hall for anything with which he might cover himself before attempting to summon assistance. There was nothing. In desperation, he put on the silver Wellington boots and removed from a table on the stage an alien mask, which, although he neither knew nor would have cared, had been used in Star Trek: The Next Generation. Holding it strategically in front of him, he explored the room and found a pair of fire doors with push bars on the wall opposite the entrance. He contemplated his options, found that there were none, pushed slowly on the bars, and the doors opened. He emerged from the warmth of the hotel to the darkness of the paved walkway at the back of the building. Events seemed now to take place without any input from the exhausted and sorry spectacle that Leslie had become. As if in a trance, he arrived at the rear corner of the building to peer round before embarking into another unknown realm. With a sudden surge of hope, he saw that there was a public telephone kiosk on the pavement at the side of the road which ran up to the hotel. All he had to do was climb the grassy bank and go through a clump of low bushes. He would even be able to reach the telephone from the security of those very bushes without exposing himself to the gaze of any passing motorist. Clutching the mask before him, he scrambled awkwardly up the bank, and as he gingerly negotiated the evergreen and holly bushes that separated him from his lifeline to normalcy, the world erupted into madness. Simultaneously, quartz halogen spotlights sprang on all around the hotel. A young courting couple in considerable disarray sprang to their feet from the bushes only feet away from him, and a police car screeched to a standstill beside the very telephone kiosk towards which he'd been heading. The police had been summoned by the triggering of the security alarm when he had opened the crash doors in the main hall. Dazzled by the lights coming at him from all directions, Leslie understandably, but ill-advisedly in the circumstances, lifted the mask to his face to shield his eyes from the glare. "Now, listen, this isn't what it seems, officer."
"Isn't it, sir? Well, then, there's a novelty,"
replied one of the policemen as he covered Leslie in a most welcome blanket.
You don't understand, man. I am a magistrate, for heaven's sake.
Were you, sir? Came the chilling reply.
The following day, Leslie appeared in court, and, as if through a fog and a very long way off, heard the lady magistrate begin, "I am constantly amazed at the brazen effrontery of criminals who appear before this bench."
George Meekish, How to Shop. In America, just as in England, you see the same shops with the same boards and windows in every town and village. Shopping, however, is an art of its own, and you have to learn slowly where to buy various things. If you are hungry, you go to the chemist's. A chemist shop is called a drugstore in the United States. It is a national institution at that. In the larger drugstores, you may be able to get drugs too, but their main business consists in selling stationery, candy, toys, braces, belts, fountain pens, furniture, and imitation jewelry. Every drugstore has a food counter with high stools in front of it, and there they serve various juices, coffee, sundaes, ice cream, sandwiches, omelets, and other egg dishes. A friend of mine in Hollywood met Otto Habsburg, the claimant to the Austrian-Hungarian throne who, I understand, apart from his hobby of calling himself a king, is an extremely charming and cultured young man. My friend called on Otto one morning in his hotel. He was received by the aide-de-camp, who declared ceremoniously, "Seine Majestat nimmt sein Frühstück in der Apotheke." His Majesty is having his breakfast in the pharmacy. If you want cigarettes, go to the grocer. If you want to have your shoes cleaned, go to the barber. If you want a radio, go to a man's shop. If you want a suitcase, go to the chemist's. On the other hand, if you want to send a telegram, avoid the post office, because telegrams are handled by private companies. Nor has the post office anything to do with the telephone either, as telephone service is supplied by the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. Nor will you find public convenience in America in the British sense of the word, because a lavatory is a strictly private enterprise in the United States. Whatever you buy, it may be exchanged later for something in the same shop. This is a great pastime with the Americans. A great many people do not really buy things. They only acquire some raw material for later exchanges. It is not unusual at all to see a lady bringing back a hat with a lot of fruit on it, and exchanging it either for real fruit or a real hat, or to see somebody bringing back a refrigerator with the remark that he made a mistake, and now he wants to subscribe to the Reader's Digest instead. You do not need to time your shopping very carefully, because you will find some shops stay open in New York all night. The big department stores keep open till 9 p.m. once a week. Should you want a meal at any time of the day or night, that is quite easy. If you have a party in your house and you decide at 2:30 a.m. to have some music, you can rush down to the corner, buy a piano, and it will be delivered to your home within half an hour. If you fancy playing golf at 3:45 in the morning, you can purchase, if you wish, a set of golf clubs and balls. I still cannot quite decide what to do with that Indian feather headdress I bought one morning at 5:15 in Greenwich Village, but I was deeply impressed by the tempting opportunity and could not resist buying it. You must be extremely careful concerning the names of certain articles. If you ask for suspenders in a man's shop, you receive a pair of braces. If you ask for a pair of pants, you receive a pair of trousers. And should you ask for a pair of braces, you receive a queer look. I should like to mention that although a lift is called an elevator in the United States, when hitchhiking, you do not ask for an elevator. You ask for a lift. There is some confusion about the word flat. A flat in America is called an apartment. What they call a flat is a puncture in your tire, or, as they spell it, tire. Consequently, the notice, flats fixed, does not indicate an estate agent where they're going to fix you up with a flat, but a garage where they are equipped to mend a punctured tire. Only once did I see the popular notice, flats fixed, on a shop which sold braziers. The customary slogan for these establishments is, "United we stand, divided we fall." George Meekish, How to Plan a Town. Britain, far from being a decadent democracy, is a Spartan country. This is mainly due to the British way of building towns, which dispenses with the reasonable comfort enjoyed by all the other weak and effeminate peoples of the world. Medieval warriors wore steel breastplates and leggings, not only for defense, but also to keep up their fighting spirit. Priests of the Middle Ages tortured their bodies with hair shirts. Indian yogis take their daily nap lying on a carpet of nails to remain fit. The English plan their towns in such a way that these replace the discomfort of steel breastplates, hair shirts, and nail carpets. On the continent, doctors, lawyers, booksellers, just to mention a few examples, are sprinkled all over the city, so you can call on a good, or at least expensive doctor in any district. In England, the idea is that it is the address that makes the man. Doctors in London are crowded in Harley Street, solicitors in Lincoln's Inn Fields, second-hand bookshops in Charing Cross Road, newspaper offices in Fleet Street, tailors in Savile Row, car merchants in Great Portland Street, theatres around Piccadilly Circus, cinemas in Leicester Square, etc. If you have a chance of replanning London, you can greatly improve on this idea. All greengrocers should be placed in Hornsey Lane, all butchers in Mile End, and all gentlemen's conveniences in Bloomsbury. Now, I should like to give you a little practical advice on how to build an English town. You must understand that an English town is a vast conspiracy to mislead foreigners. You have to use century-old little practices and tricks. 1. First of all, never build a street straight. The English love privacy and do not want to see one end of the street from the other end. Make sudden curves in the streets, and build them S-shaped too. The letters L, T, V, Y, W, and O are also becoming increasingly popular. It would be a fine tribute to the Greeks to build a few theta and omega-shaped streets. It would be an ingenious compliment to the Russians to favor the shape of Ya, and I am sure the Chinese would be more than flattered to see some hieroglyph-shaped thoroughfares. 2. Never build the houses of the same street in a straight line. The British have always been a freedom-loving race, and the freedom to build a muddle is one of their most ancient civic rights. 3. Now there are further camouflage possibilities in the numbering of houses. Primitive continental races put even numbers on one side, odd numbers on the other, and you always know that small numbers start from the north or west. In England you have this system too, but you may start numbering your houses at one end, go up to a certain number on the same side, then continue on the other side, going back in the opposite direction. You may leave out some numbers if you are superstitious, and you may continue the numbering in a side street. You also give the same number to 2 or 3 houses. But this is far from the end. Many people refuse to have numbers altogether, and they choose names. It is very pleasant, for instance, to find a street with 350 totally similar bungalows and look for the bungalow. Or to arrive in a street where all the houses have a charming view of a hill and try to find Hill View, or search for 7 Oaks and find a house with 3 apple trees. 4. Give a different name to the street whenever it bends, but if the curve is so sharp that it really makes 2 different streets, you may keep the same name. On the other hand, if, owing to neglect, a street has been built in a straight line, it may be called by many different names: High Holborn, New Oxford Street, Bayswater Road, Notting Hill Gate, Holland Park, and so on. 5. As some cute foreigners would be able to learn their way about even under such circumstances, some further precautions are necessary. Call streets by various names: street, road, place, mews, crescent, avenue, rise, lane, way, grove, park, gardens, alley, arch, path, walk, Broadway, promenade, gate, terrace, vale, view, hill, etc. While this book was at the printer's, a correspondence in the Times showed that the English have almost 60 synonyms for street. If you add to these the street names which stand alone, Piccadilly, Strand, etc., and the accepted and frequently used double names, Garden Terrace, Church Street, Park Road, etc., the number of street names reaches or exceeds 100. It has been suggested by one correspondent that this clearly proves what wonderful imagination the English have. I believe it proves the contrary. A West End street in London is not called Haymarket because the playful fancy of Londoners populates the district with romantically clad medieval food dealers, but simply because they have not noticed as yet that the hay trade has considerably declined between Piccadilly and Pall Mall in the last 300 years. Now the further possibilities arise. Gather all sorts of streets and squares of the same name in one neighborhood. Belsay's Park, Belsay's Gardens, Belsay's Green, Belsay's Circus, Belsay's Yard, Belsay's Viaduct, Belsay's Arcade, Belsay's Heath, etc. B. Place a number of streets of exactly the same name in different districts. If you have about some 20 Prince's Squares and Warwick Avenues in the town, the muddle, you may claim without immodesty, will be complete. 6. Street names should be painted clearly and distinctly on large boards. Then hide these boards carefully. Place them too high or too low, in shadow and darkness, upside down and inside out, or, even better, lock them up in a safe in your bank. Otherwise, they may give people some indication about the names of the streets. P.S. I have been told that my above-described theory is all wrong, and is only due to my Central European conceit, because the English do not care for the opinion of foreigners. In every other country, it has been explained, people just build streets and towns following their own common sense. England is the only country of the world where there is a ministry of town and country planning. This is the real reason for the muddle. James Grover Thurber. The Spreading, You Know. The latest blight to afflict the spoken word in the United States is the rapidly spreading reiteration of the phrase, "You know." I don't know just when it began moving like a rainstorm through the language, but I tremble at its increasing garbling of meaning, ruining of rhythm, and drumming upon my hapless ears. One man, in a phone conversation with me last summer, used the phrase 34 times in about 5 minutes by my own count. A young matron in Chicago got 7 you-knows into one wavy sentence, and I have also heard it as far west as Denver, where an otherwise charming woman at a garden party in August said it almost as often as a whippoorwill says, "Whippoorwill." Once, speaking of whippoorwills, I was wakened after midnight by one of those feathered hellions and lay there counting his chants. He got up to 158 and then suddenly said, "Whip," and stopped dead. I like to believe that his mate, at the end of her patience, finally let him have it. My unfortunate tendency to count you-knows is practically making a female whippoorwill out of me. Listening to a radio commentator not long ago, discussing a recent meeting of the United Nations, I thought I was going mad when I heard him using "you know" as a noun, until I realized that he had shortened United Nations Organization to UNO and was pronouncing it, "you know," as if it were, "you know." A typical example of speech you-knowed to death goes like this. The other day I saw, Harry Johnson, the, former publicity man for, the Charteris Publishing Company, and, what he wanted to talk about, strangely enough, was, something you'd never guess. This curse may have originated simultaneously on Broadway and in Hollywood, where such curses often originate. About 25 years ago, or perhaps longer, theater and movie people jammed their sentences with, "You know what I mean," which was soon shortened to, "You know," that had followed the overuse in 1920s of, "You see," or just plain, "See?" These blights often disappear finally, but a few have stayed and will continue to stay, such as, "Well," and "I mean to say," and "I mean," and "the fact is." Others seem to have mercifully passed out of limbo into limbo, such as, to go back a long way, 23 Skiddo, and "So's your old man," and "I don't know nothing from nothing," and "Believe you me." About 5 years ago, both men and women were saying things like, "He has a new Cadillac job with a built-in bar deal in the back seat." And in 1958, almost everything anybody mentioned or even wrote about was triggered. Arguments were triggered, and allergies, and divorces, and even love affairs. This gun and bomb verb seemed to make the jumpiest of the jumpy even jumpier, but it has almost died out now, and I trust that I have not triggered its revival. I am reluctantly making notes for a possible future volume to be called A Farewell to Speech, or The Decline and Fall of the King's English. I hope and pray that I shall not have to write the book. Maybe everything, or at least the language, will clear up before it is too late. Let's face it, it better had. That's for sure, and I don't mean maybe. Alexander Humphreys Woollcott. Capsule Criticism. There is a popular notion that a dramatic criticism, to be worthy of the name, must be an article of at least 1,000 words, mostly polysyllables, and all devoted, perfectly devoted, to the grave discussion of some play as written and performed. To this notion, it must be sadly admitted, each generation of writers on the theatre have lent some color. In such an article it is presumed that there will be one judicious use of the word adequate, and one resort to the expression treading the boards. Also, at least one regretful shaking of the head over the hopeless inferiority of the performance in question to A, the way it was done in some other country 2 years before, or B, the way it would have been done in the critic's own country 30 years ago. Such ingredients are expected with reasonable confidence, but one thing is certain: the piece, to be a real dramatic criticism, can scarcely be briefer than 1,000 words. Yet, I suspect it could be demonstrated that the most telling of all dramatic criticism have found expression in less than 50 words. Also, that the best of all were never written at all. To substantiate this, I have been raking my memory for the ones that have lodged there while longer and more majestical utterances have faded out of mind as completely as though they had never been written. The late Charles Frohman was likely to sum up plays most felicitously in telegrams. Once, when he was producing an English comedy at his cherished Empire Theatre in New York, he received just after the premiere a cable of eager, though decently nervous, inquiry from the author in London, who could not bear to wait until the reviews and the box office statements reached him. "How's it going?" was the inquiry. Frohman cabled back, "It's gone." Of course, many of the best capsule criticisms are classics. there was Warren's tart comment on Joe Jefferson's performance as Bob Acres in The Rivals. A brilliant feat of comedic genius made out of whole cloth, so little origin did it have in the role as originally written. "Ha!" quoth Warren, "Sheridan 20 miles away." And there was the much-quoted knifing of Hamlet by an unidentified bandit who said, after the performance, that it would have been a fine time to settle the great controversy as to who wrote the play. One need merely have watched beside the graves of Shakespeare and Bacon to see which one turned over. Fairly familiar, also, are two ascribed by tradition to Eugene Field, in the days when he was dramatic critic of the Denver Post. Of one performance of Hamlet, Field's entire review consisted of 2 short, melancholy sentences. He wrote, "So-and-so played Hamlet last night. He played it till 1 o'clock. And it was Field who haunted the declining years of Creston Clark with his review of that actor's Lear. Clark, a journeying nephew of Edwin Booth, passed through Denver and gave there a singularly unimpressive and unregal performance in that towering tragedy. Field couldn't bear it, and finally vented his emotions in one sentence. Said he, 'Mr. Clark played the king all evening, as though under constant fear that someone else was about to play the ace.' Then there was the hilarious episode, which grew out of production for one afternoon in the spring of 1917, of Wedekin's Frühlingerserwachen, which Brune translated as The Spring Offensive. In his little piece, an actor named Stein gave in the leading role the worst performance he had ever seen on any stage. Stein sued for damages, but the court decided, after some diverting testimony, that after all a critic was free to express his aesthetic judgment, however incompetent or however painful it might prove to the subject. Later, it became Mr. Brune's embarrassing duty to review another performance by the same aggrieved Stein in another play. Brune evaded the duty until the last sentence, where he could have been found murmuring, "Mr. Stein was not up to his standard." I am inclined to think, however, that the best of the tabloid reviews have been oral. Coleridge's famous comment on Keane's Hamlet, that seeing it was like reading Shakespeare by flashes of lightning, was said by him, but written by somebody else, wasn't it? The other was tossed off by that delightful companion and variegated actor, Beerbohm Tree. Hurrying from California to New York, he joined at the 11th hour the already elaborated rehearsals of Henry VIII, into which he was to step in the familiar scarlet of Wolsey. He was expected to survey whatever has been accomplished by his delegates and pass judgment. He approved cheerfully of everything until he came to the collection of damsels that had been dragged into the theatre as ladies-in-waiting to the Queen. He looked at them in pained and prolonged dissatisfaction, and then said what we have all wanted to say of the extra women in nearly every throne-room and ballroom and schoolroom scene ever since the theatre began. "Ladies," said Tree, peering at them plaintively through his monocle, "just a little more virginity, if you don't mind." Audiobook recorded by Studio Artis, 2007. Read by Michael Whiten.
Mrs. Newrich Buys Antiques by Stephen Butler Leacock. Oh, my dear, I'm so delighted to see you. It's so charming of you to come. Jane, take Mrs. Overworld's coat. Please, do come on in. Jane, take Mrs. Overworld's gloves. It's just delightful to see you, Ever since we came back from Europe, Charles and I have been just dying to have you see our things. Raising her voice. Charles, Mrs. Overworld's come over to see our new antiques. Isn't it sweet of her? He's in his study, but I don't know whether he hears. He just gets buried in reading. Charles, you know, has always been so scholarly, and so every time he gets a new price list, he just gets absorbed in it. But there's such a lot I want to show you that I can't even wait till you've had a cup of tea. This clock in the hall? An antique? Oh, yes, indeed. Isn't it just marvelous? It's a salvolatile. Does it keep good time? Gracious! What an idea! Of course not. It doesn't keep time at all. It doesn't go. I understand it never did go. That's why there's such a demand for the salvolatile clocks. You see, he was one of the really great clockmakers. None of his clocks ever went. Charles, did any of the salvolatile clocks ever go? What? Only the imitation ones. Thank you. You see, that's one way you can tell a salvolatile clock. If it is genuine, it won't go. You say it hasn't got any hands left? My dear, why, of course, it never had any. Not supposed to. We picked it up in a queer little shop in Amalfi, and the man assured us that it never had any hands. He guaranteed it. That's one of the things, you know, that you can tell by. Charles and I were terribly keen about clocks at that time, and really studied them, and the books all agreed that no genuine salvolatile has any hands. See what it says on the little label? It was gummed on it when we got it, so we left it still there. Reading. Number 5661, X. Salvolatile wall clock. No hands. Never had. Won't go. Never would. No pendulum. Breaking off her reading with animation. Of course! I'd forgotten that. No pendulum. That makes it more valuable still. That break in the side? Ah, my dear, I saw you looking at that, but I won't try to lie about it. The broken side isn't genuine. We had it broken by an expert in New York after we got back. Isn't it exquisitely done? You see, he has made the break to look exactly as if someone had rolled the clock over and stamped on it. Every genuine salvolatile is said to have been stamped upon like that. Of course, our break is only imitation, but it's extremely well done, isn't it? We go to Ferrugi's, that little place on 4th Avenue, you know, for everything that we want broken. They have a splendid man there. He can break anything. Yes, and the day we wanted the clock done, Charles and I went down to see him do it. It was really quite wonderful, wasn't it, Charles? Raising her voice. You remember the man in Ferrugi's who broke the clock for us? I'm afraid he doesn't hear, but the man really was a wonderful expert. He just laid the clock on the floor and turned it on its side, and then stood looking at it intently, and walking round and round it, and murmuring in Italian as if he were swearing at it. Then he jumped in the air and came down on it with both feet, with such wonderful accuracy. Our friend, Mr. Appin-Smith, the great expert, you know, was looking at our clock last week, and he said it was marvelous, hardly to be distinguished from a genuine fraktura. But he did say, I remember, that the better way is to throw a clock out of a 4th-story window. You see, that was the height of the Italian houses in the 13th century. Is it the 13th century, I mean, Charles? Charles, do I mean the 13th century? I mean the proper time for throwing an Italian clock out of the window. The 14th. Oh, thank you, darling. I'm always so silly about remembering the centuries of the Italian things. Of course, you see, with antiques, you simply must know the century, or you make the silliest blunders. The other day, I made the most atrocious mistake about a spoon. I called it a 12th century spoon, and in reality, it was only 11 and a half. Of course, my hostess, who owned the spoon, she collects them, was terribly put out. You see, a 12th century spoon is practically worthless. None of the great Italian spoon makers were born till the 11th century. Or have I got it backwards? Anyway, till then, my dear, the spoons made were only good for eating with. And then, the great spoon maker. Charles, what was that great Italian spoon maker's name? Spoonucci. Of course, how silly of me. Spoonucci made spoons that couldn't be eaten with. And of course, that started the craze. That glass case, that's very interesting, isn't it? I'm afraid you can't see them very well without a magnifying glass. There, try this one. They're signatures, all mounted and framed. Some are perfectly wonderful. That's Queen Elizabeth. Of course, you simply couldn't tell it if you didn't know, but if you look, you can see the Q. Or no, I think it's Peter the Great. You can't tell any of the really good ones, but Charles has a key to them. We have a little man in Highgate who picks them up for us here and there, and he always tells us what they are. That's Napoleon. Doesn't it seem wonderful to think of his actually writing it? Or no, I beg your pardon. That's not Napoleon. That's P.T. Barnum. He was one of Napoleon's marshals, I believe. Charles, was P.T. Barnum one of Napoleon's marshals? His private secretary? Oh, of course. But I'm forgetting your tea. Do pardon me. You know, I get so absorbed in my antiques that I forget everything. Do come into the drawing room and have tea. But, oh, just a minute before you sit down, do let's show this teapot. Oh, no, I don't mean that one. That's the one that the tea has been made in. But it's nothing. We got that here in New York, at Hoffany's, to make tea in. It is made of solid silver, of course, and all that, but even Hoffany's admitted that it was made in America and was probably not more than a year or so old, and had never been used by anybody else. In fact, they couldn't guarantee it in any way. But let me pour you out tea from it, and then do look at the perfectly darling teapot on the shelf beside you. Oh, don't touch it, please. It won't stand up. No. That's one of the tests. We know from that it is genuine Schwarzmacher. None of them stand up. Did I buy it here? Oh, heavens, no! You couldn't buy a thing like that here. As a matter of fact, we picked it up in a little gin shop in... What was the name of that place in Holland? Charles, what was the name of the place in Holland where there was a gin shop? What? What? Oh, yes, of course! Oberhellendam! Those Dutch names are all so picturesque, aren't they? Do you know Oberhellendam? No? Well, it's just the dearest little place. Nothing but little wee, smelly shops filled with most delightful things. All antique. Everything broken. They guarantee that there is nothing in the shop that wasn't smashed at least 100 years ago. See the label on it? It's in Dutch. Thee poot. I think that is Dutch for teapot. Gesmosh. That means smashed. Hog. Charles, what is hog in Dutch? On the teapot, darling. Hog wort. High value. Oh, of course. Would it make good tea? Oh, I imagine it would make wonderful tea. Only it leaks. That's one of the things to know it by. It's what the experts always look for in a Schwarzmacher. If it doesn't leak, it's probably just a faked-up thing not 20 years old. Silver? Oh, no. That's another test. The real Schwarzmachers were always made of pewter bound with barrel iron off the gin barrels. They try to imitate it now by using silver, but they can't. You see, the silver won't take the tarnish. It's the same way with ever so many of the old things. They rust and rot in a way that you simply cannot imitate. I have an old drinking horn that I'll show you presently. 9th century, isn't it, Charles? That is all coated inside with the most beautiful green slime, absolutely impossible to reproduce. Really and truly impossible, they say. Yes, I took it to Squeeziu's, the Italian place in London. They are the great experts on horns, you know. They can tell exactly the century and the breed of cow. And they told me that they had tried in vain to reproduce that peculiar and beautiful rot. One of their headmen said that he thought that this horn had probably been taken from a dead cow that had been buried for 50 years. That's what gives it its value, you know. We asked him, the head man, I mean, how long he thought a cow had to be dead to be of use as an antique, and he said it was very hard to say, but it had to be dead for years and years anyway. That's what the man said in London, but of course we didn't buy the teapot in London. London is simply impossible, just as hopeless as New York. You can't buy anything real there at all. so we pick things up here and there, just in any out-of-the-way corners. That little stool we found at the back of a cow stable in Loch Aberlocherty. They were actually using it for milking. And the two others? Aren't they beautiful? Though really it's quite wrong to have two chairs alike in the same room. Came from the back of a tiny little whiskey shop in Galway. Such a delight of an old Irishman sold them to us, and he admitted that he himself had no idea how old they were. They might, he said, be 15th century. Or they might not. Oh, and that reminds me, I've just had a letter from Jane. Jane is my sister, you know. That is terribly exciting. She's found a table at a tiny place in Brittany that she thinks would exactly do in our card room. She says that it is utterly unlike anything else in the room, and has quite obviously no connection with cards. But let me read what she says. Let me see. Yes, here's where it begins. A perfectly sweet little table. It probably had 4 legs originally, and even now has 2, which, I am told, is a great find, as most people have to be content with 1. The man explained that it could either be leaned up against the wall, or else suspended from the ceiling on a silver chain. One of the boards of the top is gone, but I am told that that is of no consequence, as all the best specimens of Brittany tables have at least 1 board out. Doesn't that sound fascinating? Charles, I was just reading to Mrs. Overworld Jane's letter about the table in Brittany. Don't you think you'd better cable for it right away? Yes, so do I. And Charles, ask them how much extra they would charge to smash one of the legs. And now, my dear, do have some tea. You'll like it. It's a very special kind I get. It's, oh gosh, a very old China tea that has been let rot in a coal oil barrel. You'll love it. Audiobook. Recorded at Artist Studios 2006. Read by Adam Muskin.